One of the conversations that is happening in Kenya today relates to whether the country should build a refinery or whether it should not, and the advantages or disadvantages of having a refinery in Kenya. And probably that's a question that you also have in mind. And if you are to ask me, I think this is something that is very important. It's a conversation that is welcome, and we should be having this conversation in Kenya because given that there has been a discovery of crude oil in Turkana, and that is yet to be, taken to market, we need to get the final investment decision in place and the infrastructure for the production of the crude oil in place, including the crude oil pipeline through to Lamu. They still need for a conversation about a refinery. And I know this is something that has been happening, especially given that I have been in the oil and gas industry, specifically the upstream over the last 15 years or so, that the conversation of Kenya having a refinery is something that has been happening behind the scenes. Sometimes you have conflicting interests where there are some people who would argue that there is no need for a refinery in Kenya. Others would argue that there is need for a refinery, at least even a modular refinery. But the topic for building a refinery in Kenya is one that I think, in my own opinion, makes a lot of sense. Because what is happening in the world today is a situation where you have, for example, the conflict in the Middle East, where the Strait of Hormuz is a bit of a challenge for the oil to be evacuated from the Persian Gulf. If this is the first time that you and I are meeting, I am Joe, and on this YouTube channel, I talk about oil and gas and the opportunities that exist across the oil and gas value chain. And I have a newsletter where I share more of those insights, opportunities, and ideas that can help you get into this industry. And if you would be interested, I'll leave a link in the description below for you to join that community. And the conflict in the Middle East, I think, has been an accelerator because with the Strait of Hormuz becoming an issue where the crude oil that is produced in the Persian Gulf being unable to get out into the market, it is making a lot of countries and a lot of people to start thinking of how to actually secure their national interest when it comes to the energy security. And that's a situation that also Kenya needs to actually consider, that being a net importer of petroleum products at the moment, it is very clear that you can actually be at the mercy of what is happening across the world, probably conflicts that we are not even involved in, or even other geopolitical concerns that can probably wreak a lot of havoc to your economy when you are relying on importing petroleum products. In my opinion, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for a country to be producing oil and then being reliant on imported petroleum products. I think it is now becoming clear that countries that have the capacity to produce oil should actually be able to build a refinery to produce not only for themselves, but probably even be able to process for other markets or other countries that do not have oil. And I think that's what we are seeing. That's something that is happening now. Countries are starting to rethink their strategy. If you look around, there is a renewed sense of urgency when it comes to having energy security, especially among the African countries. At least I know Uganda is building a refinery. We have seen conversations in Namibia about also the country building a refinery. We know Angola has a refinery and it has already built a new one in Kabida. You also have the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. These conversations are actually happening at the right time in the world today because the security of the African nations when it comes to being able to get their petroleum products, while the continent is still an oil-producing continent, has become important because of what is happening in the world. So, should Kenya actually build a refinery? If you ask me, the answer is yes. And I know there's a conversation about not only building a refinery related to, the oil that will be produced in Turkana. But also now there is the whole conversation about a Dangote refinery that is being proposed to be built in Kenya. And one of the things that people are raising when it comes to that proposed Dangote refinery in Kenya is that it is a 650,000 barrels per day refinery, while Kenya does not have that kind of capacity, or is not even projected to produce oil at that capacity. But it is important to note that it's not necessary that refinery that would be constructed by Dangote would rely on feedstock or supplies from Kenya alone. And I would give you an example of a country like Singapore, which has been able to build or to become an oil and gas hub in the Southern Asia or that particular region without necessarily being an oil producing nation themselves. And I think for Kenya, this would be sort of the direction that I would assume we would take. We would become an oil and gas hub, even if we are not producing as much to be able to supply that 650,000 barrels per day kind of a refinery. And even beyond just the petroleum product that would be processed through such a refinery, or even if we had a modular refinery in Turkana, it's good to look at the multiplier effect of such an investment, because you're looking at the larger petrochemical industry. And that would be a bonus for Kenya as well as the entire East African region. So the conversation about a refinery is coming at the right time. I think it's important to look at both the short-term as well as the long-term impact of such an investment, including probably in a situation where if we had a refinery locally, it would directly impact the fuel prices that you get at the petrol station. It is important to note that while the crude oil prices internationally affect the prices that you end up paying at the petrol station, we also have an issue related to tax, and probably that's also a discussion for another day, because the composition of the fuel prices in Kenya, almost 50% of it is because of taxation. And if you had a refinery, meaning that you're processing your own domestic, or you're solving your own domestic consumption, and then you add that into a situation where the government would reduce taxation for petroleum products, then you can see how powerful that would be, given that our economy is heavily reliant on industry that consume a lot of petroleum products. So it is important that this conversation happens. I'm particularly happy as a person who is in the oil and gas industry to see this happening in Kenya. And probably it will not be hijacked by people who might be interested in, getting kickbacks or cutting corners here and there to sabotage this kind of a conversation and eventual investment into such a refinery or such kind of infrastructure. Kenya has had a refinery in the past at Changamwe, but that refinery has become redundant and has been transformed or converted into a storage facility. And I think that was the right decision to make with regard to that particular facility. But now that there's a conversation about a new refinery, or even having investors such as Aliko Dangote investing in a refinery in Kenya, I think it's important to look at it as a positive for the country as well as a positive for the region to solve a lot of petroleum issues that the country has, including giving us an opportunity to probably have some sense of security when it comes to the supplies in relation to the petroleum sector. And this is going to be it from me in this particular video. I would be very interested to continue having this conversation and to know your thoughts on what you think in terms of whether Kenya should build a refinery. And if you'd want to learn more about oil and gas industry, watch the video on your screen right now. Subscribe to this YouTube channel if you have not, and I'm going to see you in my next video.